Hello everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Understanding Happiness, Science and the Buddha. And this is a podcast fundamentally about the topic of happiness, not just how to achieve it, but also how to conceptualize it. Where does it come from? What is it? What are the different kinds? And in doing so, we're taking two broad perspectives. We're looking at it through the lens of the sciences and the lens of the humanities, which means that we're using the most up-to-date, reliable scientific research, but we're also cross-referencing that with ancient philosophy, theology, different schools of thought, different thinkers from thousands of years of human experience. And we're seeing where we can find the interaction between those two things. Where do we find the overlap between what the sciences say about happiness and what various different philosophies say about happiness? Because it's in that overlap that we're most likely to find the right answers. And by integrating the sciences and the humanities into our view on happiness, I think we get the best possible, most well-rounded answer. Now, in this podcast, there are 5 episodes. The first episode is this one, and it's about understanding our mind. More on that in a moment. The second episode is about understanding where happiness comes from. How has it evolved? What's going on in the brain in the form of physical chemicals and neurotransmitters and other measurable correlates of happiness, and the role of sociality and morality in the role of happiness. Episode 3 is about the scientific study of happiness. What is the modern scientific study all about, essentially? What does it say? What are its different theories? What are its different postulates? How can we understand happiness in a technical way? Episode 4 is about achieving happiness. It's about integrating all the information in the past 3 episodes to come up with a formula on what aspects of life lead to happiness. And finally, episode 5 is about the meaning of life in general. What gives meaning to human beings and how can we achieve that? Now, in this podcast, you can listen to each episode individually. It's designed so that each episode sort of tells its own unique story, but all of them are, of course, interrelated. And I think you get the most out of this podcast listening to them all in order, because I've tried to design this as a kind of journey. I want to guide you through first your own brain, then the nature of happiness, then putting them together, then talking about how we can achieve it. I think it makes most sense. It's the most fluid and the most comprehensive when it's all watched in order, but it's okay. You don't need to do that. And of course, in the bio of this podcast, I've attached some appendices. The first one is a literature review, which I've done about some of the theories of happiness. More on that in future episodes. Another one is a list of source books. This project is the culmination of years of research and quite literally hundreds of books that I've read about the various kind of topics that have got into this, both in the sciences, social sciences, and humanities. And I'm not saying that for purposes of self-aggrandizement. I'm saying that for the purposes of credibility. This has really been a labor of love, and a lot of work has gone into this. Finally, the final appendix is a link to the podcast that I normally run called Polymath, which, as we'll see, has some overlap with some of the topics that I'm saying here. Now, as a disclaimer, this is an academic podcast and based on research, but I am not a professional. I'm currently studying medicine, and I'm going to be studying a master's in psychology next year, but I'm still not a psychologist or a doctor, and that is important that I say that. Regardless, this is still a synthesis of the most up-to-date research and scientific consensus from experts and professionals, and I do still think it's reliable in that sense, and still reliable in that I think that it can be genuinely useful for helping people understand happiness and pursue happiness. Now, this episode in particular is all about breaking down our psyche, because happiness is ultimately a mental phenomenon. And I think if we want to understand happiness, a necessary backdrop to even the whole topic of happiness is just where in the brain all this is playing out. How does our mind work? Also, I think that understanding how our mind works and how our brain works is also really important, because as we're going to be talking about in this series, a lot of happiness is on outlook. It's about outlook. It comes from our worldview, our perspective on the world and ourselves. And I think understanding ourselves, understanding our own minds is a really, really key part in that, and therefore a really, really key part in achieving happiness. Now, lots of different scientists have, throughout recent centuries, come up with their own conceptualizations of how to divide the mind. The most famous one, or at least one of the most famous conceptualizations, is that given by Freud, where he divided the psyche into id, ego, and superego. Now, Freud has generated a huge amount of controversy, and his theories weren't based on experimentation as such, but I do still think it's worth discussing his conceptualization of id, ego, and superego as it's relevant here. So the id is the part of the brain or rather the part of the mind that's present at birth. And it's kind of the source of our desires, our impulses, our urges. It's this kind of I want part of the mind. It's all about this kind of fundamental engine of psychic energy. It's the motor that drives us. It's basically the desire for food, the desire for sex, the desire for respect, the desire for X, Y, and Z. It's basically this kind of emotional / motivational side of the brain. The ego is the part of the mind, not the part of the brain, the part of the mind. The ego is the part of the mind that tries to figure out how the desires of the id can be realized in a suitable, socially acceptable way. Whereas the id is necessarily subconscious, the ego is conscious. It has subconscious components, but the ego can mostly be understood as this kind of conscious part of you consciously thinking, okay, I recognize that I have these desires. How can I meet these desires? For example, if you're at a meeting at work and you're really, really hungry, it may not be acceptable for you to just start eating there and then. So you may seek to distract yourself by getting involved in the meeting or thinking of something else, and therefore averting some of that hunger until the meeting's over and you can eat food. Now, the superego has two components. One of them is the conscious and one of them is the ego ideal. The superego is basically this kind of internalization of the standards of society and the moral instruction given to you by your parents. It's that side of you that contains, in the form of the conscious, guilt and remorse. It's molded by, as you grow up, things being forbidden to you and the fear of punishment for transgressing social norms gradually forms this sense of right and wrong, what you can and can't do, or rather should and shouldn't do. The ego ideal is this sense of what you should be doing. It is the way that you should be behaving in society. It's this kind of aggregate of moral and behavioral standards that you hold yourself to. And the ego fundamentally is about mediating between the id and the superego. And psychic health comes from this balance between these three different components, the id, the ego, and the superego. And it relies on something called ego strength, which is just the ability of the ego to mediate in a healthy way between the id and the superego. And the idea of therapy, or one of the benefits of therapy in the Freudian sense, is to increase that ego strength. Now, this is a model that's helpful to us, but let's turn to a scientific model which is a bit more modern, more backed by scientific evidence, and more accepted in the scientific community. And that is the model proposed by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And there are these scientists, Kahneman actually won the Nobel Prize in behavioral economics, and you may know them from the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which you may have seen in bookstores. And essentially, Kahneman and Tversky proposed this model of human cognition, where in human cognition, i.e., decision-making and thinking and rationality, is split into two systems of thought. System 1 of thought and System 2 of thought. Now, System 1 of thought is basically both System 1 and System 2 arise as a way to help human beings make decisions. And human beings make around 35,000 decisions a day. 98% of these decisions are made by System 1. Only 2% is made by System 2. System 1 is fast. It's automatic. That's the key thing. It's subconscious, or unconscious rather. It's very often, it's based on emotions. It's this kind of uncontrolled, undeliberative, unconscious kind of instant thinking. For example, whenever you go on autopilot, so whenever you're driving home from work or school or uni or what have you, and you're just kind of in your own world, all those decisions on how to actually drive are made by System 1 of consciousness. Or rather, System 1 of thought. It's fast and it's efficient. It takes a lot of shortcuts. It handles a lot of parallel processes at once and is able to synthesize a lot of that information at the expense of taking cognitive shortcuts, called heuristics. We'll get to that in a moment. Let's just give some examples of what System 1 can do. System 1, for example, will determine that one object is closer to you than another object. It completes the phrase war and something. It solves 2 plus 2. It reads text. It goes on autopilot and drives a car. It understands simple sentences. If you become really, really skilled at something, then as you learn a skill and as you get more proficient in it, the system of cognition that's responsible for that shifts from system 2 to system 1. For example, thinking of a good chess move is something that really engages you for most people, but if you're a chess master, thinking of a good chess move is just delegated to system 1. Now, system 2 makes 2% of the decisions in human life, and it's conscious. This is what we're thinking of when you are actually thinking and making a decision. It's slow. It takes more effort. But it means that it involves logic and calculation and deliberation. It basically means that the potential of system 2 is much greater. It's still affected by these cognitive shortcuts called heuristics, but it at least has the capacity to overcome them if you're aware of them. But it can only focus on one thing at a time. That is to say that you as a human being can only focus cognitively on one task at a time. What is some of the stuff that system 2 can do? It can count the number of A's in a certain text. It can park into a tight parking space. It can recall difficult pieces of information and communicate them to other people. It can solve 17 times 24. It can look for certain features. For example, if I say to you, go into a crowd and look for a woman wearing a red hat, that's system 2 being activated. System 2 can be motivational as well. It can be, for example, preparing yourself for the start of a sprint. It can be trying to recognize a sound. It can be trying to determine how appropriate a particular behavior is in a certain setting. The key thing is that system 2 is deliberative and it's conscious. System 1 is fast and it's unconscious. Now, we talked about heuristics earlier. What is a heuristic? A heuristic is essentially a kind of cognitive shortcut. And they evolve because system 1 is processing so much information. It does so much on a daily basis that for the purposes of making quick decisions and for expending less mental effort on those decisions, it uses these kinds of shortcuts. And we know these kind of shortcuts. We recognize them in colloquial parlance as cognitive biases. I'll give some example. So, an example of a heuristic is the anchoring bias. The anchoring effect is a tendency to be influenced by irrelevant numbers. So, for example, if there's an experiment done where lots of people were asked whether Gandhi was more than 114 years old when he died. There was also another experiment where people were asked whether Gandhi was more than 35 years old when he died. The people who were kind of posed that question using the number 114 guessed greater numbers than people who were posed the question of whether he was over 35 years old. Because the number that we're given forms a kind of anchoring. It is, and that basically our brain makes decisions and it goes through the process of cognition based on being biased by that information, i.e. it is a form of cognitive shortcut. Salesmen use this a lot, by the way. For example, if you haggle with someone, they'll deliberately name a very high price. It's unreasonable so that your kind of cognition is anchored around that high number. Some other heuristics. The availability heuristic. It's this kind of mental shortcut, and it's when people make a judgment about how likely something is to happen on the basis of how easy it is to think of examples. For example, it's like saying if you can think of it, it operates on the notion that if you can think of something, then that must be important. Basically, it means that the first piece of information that pops to our mind has an exaggerated importance in human cognition. Another heuristic is the conjunction fallacy. Basically, an example is how system 1 will substitute a simpler question for a more difficult one. An example is the Linda problem. So this is one of the experiments that Kahneman has conducted. By the way, this whole system 1, system 2 model is based on a wealth of research, a lot of which I'm omitting for the sake of brevity, but it is there and there is lots of research behind it. So subjects were told about this imaginary person called Linda. She was young, single, outspoken, and intelligent. And as a student, she was very concerned with discrimination and social justice. These people were then asked whether it was more likely that Linda would be a bank teller or whether she'd be a bank teller and an active feminist. Most people, and in fact, just think about that to yourself right now. Is it more likely that she'll be a bank teller or more likely that she'll be a bank teller and an active feminist? The overwhelming response that people give is that she's more likely to be a feminist bank teller. But this actually violates the laws of probabilities. All feminist bank tellers have to be bank tellers, whereas not all bank tellers have to be feminists. So based on the laws of probability alone, it has to be more likely that she's a bank teller rather than she's a feminist bank teller. What's happening here cognitively is that system 1 is substituting the question, what's more likely, is she going to be a bank teller or a feminist bank teller, for the question, is Linda a feminist? To which people say yes, and that therefore they answer, is she going to be a feminist bank teller? Some other examples of heuristics. An optimism bias. there's actually different kinds of biases. There's an optimism bias wherein often when we're making decisions, we have an unwarranted optimism. For example, in 2002, as a result of a bunch of surveys, people said that American kitchen remodeling was expected to cost around $19,000 on average. In reality, it cost $39,000 on average. The result of the optimism bias is that we get overconfidence and the illusion of control. But there's also another bias called the negativity bias, which is when faced with negative and positive events, people's minds tend to pick out and focus on the negative events. So this is actually quite prevalent in daily life. You may have noticed that negative stuff in your head will stick out to you much more than positive stuff. You can have a great day, but if one negative thing happens, that's often what you think of when you think of the day. Now, some other biases. Framing effect, which is basically based on how you present a context. For example, if you ask the question, would you opt for surgery if the survival rate is 90%? Most people say yes. Whereas if you ask people, would you opt for a surgery if the mortality rate is 10%? Few people would say yes. It's the exact same question, but based on how you frame it, it's different. Another form of heuristic is one of the phenomena that give rise to nostalgia, in that over time, even though the negativity bias is quite strong in recent memory, when it comes to remembering far back, your brain kind of gradually filters out negative memories unless they're really large negative memories, which basically means that when we look back at earlier phases of our life, our brain generally stores the positive sides of these periods rather than negative sides of these periods. So we look back on them with this kind of longing, thinking of them as this great golden age. When in reality, that may not necessarily be true. The idea is that our brain has just done that. It's a kind of cognitive shortcut in order to simplify mental effort, and in this case, to kind of protect our brain from unnecessary misery. Another fallacy, the sunk cost fallacy, which is basically something we're all familiar with. When we're doing a task and we've sunk a lot of time into it or effort into it, and we want to keep pursuing that task, even though we kind of know that there's no point in doing it. The point is, there's loads and loads of heuristics and cognitive biases, and these arise from system 1 of thought, but they kind of have prevalence in system 2 of thought as well. They take place, they're something that we're consciously aware of, but they're coming from system 1. It's also worth noting that system 1 is very often based on our emotions, and we're going to talk about the link between cognition and emotion later, but it's just really important to note that that kind of automatic system of cognition and our heuristics are often grounded in the emotional side of our brain, whereas system 2 generally acts on these kind of gut feelings and kind of system 1 unconscious cognitive processes, and then just seeks rationalizations for them. More on this later, but the conclusion of that, the implication of that, which we're going to be exploring later, is that human beings aren't primarily rational creatures. They have the conception of rationality, but emotion is more important in decision making than rationality, which, by the way, is exemplified in the fact that if you've ever tried to have a political discussion with someone and to change someone's mind, you'll notice that it's notoriously hard. And that's because a lot of the time, people's systems too of thought, their kind of conscious rationality, is based not on actual rationality, but on cognitive shortcuts and rationalization of emotions. But more on that in a bit. Now, we have this system 1 and system 2 of thought. We also have this Freudian system of thought. What is another way? So system 1 and system 2 divide the human cognition into these kind of dual systems, system 1 and system 2. How do we divide the entirety of the human consciousness, involving not just cognition, but also the emotional and motivational side of our minds? Now, system 1 does kind of draw on the emotional and the kind of motivational side of our brains, but there is another way of conceptualizing the human mind, which does this much more explicitly, and it kind of splits the human mind into 2 categories, but it also has parallels to Freud's id, ego, superego conceptualization, which is why I brought up the Freudian idea at the beginning. Now, this paradigm is actually not a scientific paradigm, it's a philosophical one, because it's one advanced by the Buddha. The Buddha used this metaphor to divide how the mind should be conceptualized. And by the way, this podcast is called Science and the Buddha, firstly because the Buddha is just a sort of symbol for the humanity side of the podcast, but secondly because I think this model is so useful. I think it's so good for understanding the human mind, and it's so well backed by science as well, and by neuroscience and neuroanatomy and psychology, that I had to give the Buddha credit for it by putting him in the title of this podcast. This model of the mind is that the mind consists of a rider riding an elephant. So a rider and an elephant. Now, the rider represents the conscious reasoning side of the human brain, or the human mind. It represents our willpower, our self-discipline, our rationality, our intellect, our conscious thinking, our system 2 of thought, our ego and our superego. And that rider is riding an elephant. And that elephant represents our subconscious thought. It represents our instincts, our desires, our urges, our cognitive biases, our system 1 of thought, our emotional side, our motivational side, and our kind of system of pursuing our desires. It refers to instinct, emotion, and the subconscious. It's sort of like system 1 and the id in the Kahneman and Freudian models respectively. But here's the thing. So that elephant, it's very worth knowing that elephant is an animal. It's not something we can consciously control. We are the rider. Our consciousness is the rider on top of that elephant, and we can maybe steer that elephant. But if that elephant decides to do something while we're riding, if that elephant decides to go somewhere, we're going there too. The point is that the power balance between the rider and the elephant shifts towards the elephant. And as a rider, if you want to get the elephant to do what you want to do, the best way to do that isn't by a monumental exercise of willpower and trying to haul the elephant towards the path that you want him to go to. It actually comes from gradually training the elephant and gradually picking up new habits and also kind of altering that emotional, subconscious, instinctive side of the brain gradually. Now, this model is something we're going to be elaborating on a lot in this podcast, but again, the point of this podcast is to find the overlap between the philosophy side of it and the scientific side of it. All of this glorious Buddhist model doesn't actually have any validity unless it maps onto science in some way. Luckily, it does indeed. It actually maps onto science very, very well. And in order to explore that, we need to first understand how the brain works and then understand how the mind works. Let's just go through a brief tour of our brain and how it works. So our brain is part of a system in our body called the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain has 3 main subdivisions. All invertebrates have these subdivisions, apart from some sort of exceptions of hagfishes and lampreys. There is the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The technical terms for these are the rhombencephalon for the hindbrain, the mesencephalon for the midbrain, and the prosencephalon for the forebrain. Let's look at the hindbrain first, the rhombencephalon. The rhombencephalon can be subdivided into 2 other categories. There is the metencephalon, which is the pons and the cerebellum, these 2 parts of the brain. You may have heard of the cerebellum, and the myelencephalon, which is the medulla. Now, what's actually going on? What are these different things doing? So the medulla is short for the medulla oblongata, and it's responsible for the kind of respiratory control and cardiovascular control of the body, i.e., it regulates our heartbeat, it regulates our breathing rate, it just kind of does all this automatic regulation of these really 2 important systems to keep us alive. So you'll notice that you don't need to expend any conscious effort to keep your heart beating, and even though I may make you aware of your breathing by saying this, you will normally just be breathing automatically. That's because these are just automatic functions done by these quite basic or lower areas of the brain. The medulla is also responsible for kind of gaining information from the body about taste, hearing, balance. It controls our neck and facial muscles, etc. The pons, which is part of the metencephalon, has roles in breathing, sleeping, tasting, bladder control, hearing, swallowing, taste, eye and facial movements, posture, facial sensation, information about movement and sensation, lots of different functions. But again, most of what the pons is doing is automatic. All of this kind of stuff, just kind of keeping our bodies running in the background. It's not something we're paying any conscious attention to. Now, the cerebellum it's the kind of movement, posture, balance part of our brain. It maintains our posture, coordinates our head and eye movements, fine-tunes other movements. It's involved in motor learning. For example, learning how to ride a bike, learning how to play piano. More recently, the cerebellum is thought to have some roles in emotion and cognition at the moment. But the cerebellum is I don't want to say a basic part of our brain, but it's a side of our brain where the difference in cerebellum complexity between humans and other animals is less than in other parts of our brain, such as our frontal lobe. Because here's the thing, all vertebrates have that midbrain, hindbrain, forebrain commonality, but the proportion and the relative development and complexity of these different parts does vary. As species gain closer evolutionary to human beings, the forebrain gains more and more complexity. It becomes more and more recognizably complicated, or human-like, as we could call it colloquially. Now, the midbrain, also known as the mesencephalon, does a few kind of miscellaneous things. For example, it's involved in vision, in hearing, in motor control, in the sleeping and waking up cycle. It's involved in physiological arousal. That's not the same as sexual arousal. Physiological arousal is basically like alertness, essentially. And the midbrain is also involved in temperature regulation. And again, all this stuff with the hindbrain and the midbrain, most of these functions are going on subconsciously, automatically, in the background, keeping our body running. We can say that these are part of the elephant, for example. Now, the forebrain is also known as the prosencephalon. And when it comes to the animal kingdom, the greatest differences between the different kind of animals in the animal kingdom is in the forebrain. The forebrains of primates, tree shrews, birds, and reptiles show a greater difference than the differences in the hindbrain between these different categories of animals. Now, the prosencephalon itself has two kind of subdivisions. There's the diencephalon and the telencephalon. The diencephalon has a few components. The diencephalon is kind of contained within the brain. Anatomically, we would say that the diencephalon is in the medial surface of the brain, i.e. it's kind of in the middle. We can't see it from the outside. Now, the diencephalon consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is kind of like the gatekeeper of the brain. It's collating, regulating, and modulating and transmitting sensory information from all around the body to the cerebrum, which is where most of the kind of actual thinking in the brain takes place. The hypothalamus does loads and loads of different things. It's basically responsible for homeostasis. Homeostasis is maintaining a constant internal environment despite changes in the external environment. For example, you could be in the Arctic or the Sahara Desert, but your body will try and maintain a constant body temperature. The hypothalamus, for example, is also responsible for drinking, eating, maternal behavior, circadian rhythms, growth, sexual reproduction. It's very extensively connected to the rest of the central nervous system and actually forms this kind of bridge between the nervous system in the body and the hormonal system in the body. More on that later. The diencephalon also consists of the pineal gland, which is the gland in the brain that secretes melatonin, which you may have heard of. It's the hormone that's responsible for regulating our sleep and wakefulness cycle. So the pineal gland, important in regulating our sleep cycle and circadian rhythm. Now, the telencephalon is also known as the end brain, and it is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest region of the human brain. If you look at a picture of this human brain, it's this kind of large, wrinkly, cauliflower region of the brain. And it's wrinkly because the wrinkles in the surface allow us to fit more neurons or nerve cells in. Now, the cerebrum is responsible for higher functions, such as perception, motor planning, cognition, emotion, and memory. But all mammals have a cerebrum. And all mammals have a cerebral cortex. More on that later. The point is that in different animals, depending on how late they evolved relative to humans, the proportion of complexity of different regions varies. More on that later. Now, cerebrum has the subcortical regions and the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the surface of the cerebrum. It's what we see on the outside. Now, the lobes of the cerebrum, you may have heard, or you may remember from GCSE biology, if it has been too long ago, that the cerebral cortex has 4 lobes. The frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. In reality, there are 6 lobes to the cerebral cortex. There's all those 4 lobes, but there's also the limbic lobe, which is just this scattering of areas of the cerebral cortex involved in the limbic system. More on that later. And also the insula, this region in the center of the cerebrum responsible for feelings like disgust, consciousness, but also interoception, i.e. our perception of our own internal state. Now, the cerebral cortex has 2 subdivisions, a neocortex, which all mammals have, but it wildly varies in complexity, and an allocortex. Now, how does all this map on to the elephant and the rider? Well, the frontal lobe is kind of like, it's this region of the cerebral cortex, and you can kind of think of it as the action cortex of the brain. It's responsible for motor function, so us moving around. So when we initiate conscious movement, that comes from the frontal lobe. It's also responsible for speech, behavior, plays a role in emotion, and for cognition. Now, a part of that frontal lobe, and in fact the largest part of the frontal lobe in humans, is the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is the executive center of the brain. It's what makes us human. Now, animals do have a prefrontal cortex, But whereas in humans, the prefrontal cortex takes up 35% of our brain volume, in a cat, for example, it takes up 4% of our brain volume. This goes a long way towards explaining the difference in intelligence between these two species. The prefrontal cortex is really what makes us human. It's the source of rationality, of intellect, of decision-making, of planning, of reasoning. It's this kind of the most advanced, in quote marks, part of the brain. Now, in terms of the rider-elephant metaphor, we can think of the rider as the prefrontal cortex. We can also think of it as the various different parts of the brain where consciousness arises out of. Now, the idea of consciousness is a very, very complex problem in the sciences. There's lots of research on what actually causes it, what actually is it, but we have some kind of idea of regions of the brain involved in consciousness, which are the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the insula. The insula, as I said, is its own lobe. The anterior cingulate cortex is not part of the prefrontal cortex. But we can think of the rider as the prefrontal cortex and, to a lesser degree, the other parts of the brain involved in consciousness. What is the elephant? The elephant is the hindbrain, the midbrain. It's the kind of motivation reward system in our brain. More on that in a bit. And most importantly, it's a part of our brain called the limbic system. Now, you may have heard of the limbic system, what it is. The limbic system is mostly subcortical and in the cerebrum. There is a part of the limbic system called the substantia nigra, which is in the midbrain, and sometimes the cerebellum is counted to be part of the limbic system. There's no universal consensus on all the different components of the limbic system, but there is this kind of rough consensus. Now, what is the limbic system? The limbic system is what mediates between our entirely automatic parts of the brain, our kind of hindbrain and midbrain sides of the brain, the kind of parts that are generally fairly constant in lots of different animals, the part of the brain that, according to a discredited way of organizing the brain, we can think of as our reptile brain. The limbic system mediates between that reptile automatic brain and the cognitive, higher, rational side of the brain. The limbic system ultimately is an emotional guidance system based on past experiences. It generates emotion in the brain, and that emotion generation is guided by the past experiences that we've already gone through as human beings, which explains why different people have different stress responses to different things. We can think of the limbic system both as a threat response system, as a stress generation system, and also as a positive emotion generation system. Now, one of the most important centers of the limbic system is a part of the brain called the amygdala. You may have heard of this before. Now, amygdala actually comes from the Latin word for almond because it's kind of shaped like an almond in the brain. There's actually 2 amygdalae in the brain. There's one on each cerebral hemisphere. It's often referred to colloquially as this amygdala singular, but that's not actually true. There's 2. Now, amygdalae are the kind of emotion matching parts of the brain. They take in an incoming situation, and that can be in our external environment or in a situation which we're imagining, and they basically assign an emotion to it. They determine whether that situation is a threat or stressful, or whether it's a situation of nourishment or intimacy. The amygdala basically imparts emotion to our experiences and what we're feeling. Now, the hippocampal formation is another really key part of the limbic system. And the hippocampal formation is comprised of the hippocampus and some other bits. It's not actually where long-term memories in the brain are stored. It can be best thought of as the memory maker. And here's the thing. It's very strongly linked to the amygdala. Memories often have an emotional component to them, as we know. So, some other parts of the limbic system. The hypothalamus, which, as we've said, is responsible for homeostasis, but is also really important for kind of bridging the nervous systems and the hormonal systems. More on that later. It's also got these structures called the septal nuclei, the nucleus accumbens, the substantia nigra. A little bit more on that later, but basically these are just structures in the brain comprised with reward and motivation and pleasure, and they are below the cortex. But the limbic system also has some regions in the cerebral cortex, hence the limbic lobe that we mentioned earlier. An example of this is the cingulate gyrus, which is this large is a relative term, but it's this swathe of the brain cerebral cortex responsible for decision making, prioritizations, and emotional regulation. the limbic system is also quite strongly linked to regions in the cerebral cortex which aren't technically part of the limbic system. For example, the prefrontal cortex is really strongly linked to our limbic system, which helps provide this kind of scientific backing to the notion that a lot of our rationality and our rational thought is actually based on emotion. And of course, there's some other bits and bobs to the limbic system. For example, the mammillary nuclei, which are also subcortical. These are the structures which are generally held to be part of the limbic system. But again, there's some variations of what different people state is the limbic system. Now, the limbic system is what generates a kind of stress response in our body. And that stress response in our body generated by the limbic system basically means that by this activation of the region of our brain, the internal environment of our body actually changes. So, for example, our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure might go up, our blood sugar levels might change, our immune systems and digestive systems may change, our reproductive organs may be disabled in a moment of stress response, etc., etc. The point is that the stress response in the brain has loads and loads of different effects in the body. Now, and these effects are mediated by different systems of the body, mostly the nervous system, the hormonal system, and the immune system. More on that later. Now, this process of the internal environment changing to deal with our external environment is called allostasis, similar to the concept of homeostasis, which is about maintaining a constant internal environment. But in allostasis, it's about this change in the internal environment within limits. For example, in a stress response, our heart rate may change, but our heart rate isn't going to get to 350 beats a minute, for example. Homeostasis defines boundaries within which our internal environment can vary. Now, stress, this kind of psychological and physiological response, that physical stress response, can also be called an allostatic load. Now, that threat defense response activates not just in threats in our external environment, but also imagined threats. Hence the famous Mark Twain quote, which he actually borrowed from a French philosopher many centuries before called Michel de Montaigne. My life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened. Now, that threat defense response generally is seen to be this kind of fight or flight response. In reality, it's a fight, flight, or freeze response. All of these are adapted to survival. Fight for dealing with a threat, flight for escaping a threat, freeze for playing dead and submitting to a threat. All of these are survival strategies. Hence, the threat defense response leads to these three kinds of behavior. Freezing up is often seen in people in very stressful situations. And again, all of this stress and kind of threat response system has evolved to boost human survival. Because the human environment which we're now in is so different from the human environment where we evolved in, we're no longer hunter-gatherers on the plains of the African continent, which means that often that threat defense response can have quite bad consequences, but it's evolved for a reason. Now, here's the thing. That threat defense response is really strongly linked to memories and pattern recognition. So, for example, if I show you an abstract picture of yellow and black, your threat response won't activate. If I then increase the resolution on this blurry picture so that it reveals a snake, for a lot of people, their threat defense response does activate. And that's because it's evoked when the brain recognizes a pattern, i.e. the particular coloration and shape and movements of a snake. The point is that the limbic system is constantly referencing patterns and our memories. Now, here's the thing. The limbic system and this kind of threat defense response in our brain, which generates the freeze, fight, or flight response, works in about 10 milliseconds. It's very quick. It has to be very quick because it's evolved for survival. But the actual conscious process of processing a threat and dealing with it takes around 200 to 500 milliseconds. So that emotional response is much, much faster than our cognitive response, which, by the way, you probably notice in real life when, for example, you're walking down the street, you hear a car backfire, and you kind of jump before you realize, oh wait, it's just a car backfiring. Now, that freeze, fight, or flight response, what is actually causing that in the human body? A few different systems. Mostly the hormonal system, also known as the endocrine system, and the nervous system. Now, let's just explore the endocrine system a bit more. There is an axis of organs and components in your body called the HPA axis, and it consists of the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands. And what happens is, as part of that threat defense response, your hypothalamus activates. It tells the pituitary gland to make a certain hormone, and then that hormone reaches the adrenal glands, and then in response, the adrenal glands generate a certain hormone. This is a slower process than the process of the nervous system. Now, the nervous system you've probably heard of already, but there's lots of different subdivisions of the nervous system. First of all, there's the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now, the somatic nervous system are the nerves that we can consciously control. So, for example, when you move your arm up and down, what's happening is that nerve impulses are being sent down nerves, which are part of that somatic nervous system. They go to the muscles in your arm, and they move the arm. The autonomic nervous system consists of these nerves that we can't actually consciously control. They just happen. For example, the movements of our gut, the dilations of our pupils, our hair standing on end, our heart rate, all of this stuff is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We cannot consciously control it. Now, there's two subdivisions, of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And these two nervous systems, they're kind of like superhighways stretching out through the body, linking our central nervous system, linking our brain to all the different organs of the body. And the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system have kind of opposite effects on each part of the body. An example is the sympathetic nervous system dilates our pupils, the parasympathetic nervous system constricts our pupils. The sympathetic nervous system increases our heart rate, the parasympathetic nervous system decreases our heart rate. The sympathetic nervous system kind of disables the digestive system so that we're not wasting energy digesting our food in a risky situation. The parasympathetic system does the opposite. Now, the sympathetic system works very, very quickly. And what's happening is the amygdala, this part of our limbic system, sends these impulses to the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands pump out adrenaline. And adrenaline gives us this whole host of different physiological outcomes, which we're kind of familiar with. It's basically, adrenaline is in large part responsible for this fight or flight response. Now, the HPA axis in the threat response has a different end product. The end product is this hormone called cortisol. More on that later. But cortisol and adrenaline work in different time frames. So if you give someone an acute stressor, i.e. a short-term source of stress, their adrenaline levels will peak during that stressor, and they'll return to baseline after, for example, in a particular experiment where people were given a hostile interview, the adrenaline levels returned to baseline after around 45 minutes. However, cortisol levels peaked after that actual stressor and still didn't return to baseline after about an hour, which means that if your life has multiple stressful situations, you get this constantly raised level of cortisol in the body. Clinically, this is known as raised cortisol. Now, why is that a big deal? Because cortisol, as part of that threat defense response, does many different things. What are some of the things that it does? Cortisol limits the blood flow to the skins. It limits the blood flow to the bowels and slows the activity in our bowels and digestive system. It causes resistance to insulin. It suppresses our reproductive system. It suppresses our immune system. It suppresses healing. It promotes inflammation. It causes the loss of collagen in the skin, which is in part what gives our skin a youthful appearance. It decreases synthesis of bone, so it gets more fragile. It primes the adrenaline gland to make more adrenaline. It raises our blood pressure. It increases our blood sugar and blood fat. It also increases blood supply to any tumors if we have them. It decreases cell lifespan. It causes fatigue. And it basically decreases the surveillance of the immune system that prevents tumors from normally forming. Now, all of this is fine in a short-term situation where stuff is going down. But in the long term, this is really, really bad. In fact, that chronic threat response, that chronic stress response, is often like the same as what many chronic diseases or pathologies actually do, which means that there's this really strong overlap between the development of physical conditions and physical diseases and chronic levels of stress. Also, cortisol causes this kind of feedback loop where it molds the brain. Basically, the brain is what's known as plastic. And that doesn't mean that it's made of cling film. The idea of neuroplasticity or brain plasticity is the idea that the brain can change itself. It's constantly remolding itself based on multiple different factors in the body. And what cortisol does is remodel the brain so that the amygdala actually gets bigger, basically meaning that we have a stronger threat response. The hippocampus gets smaller, so it's harder to access positive memories. And the central nervous system gets sensitized to pain. i.e. pain is felt at a greater intensity. Also, so cortisol kind of causes this positive, negative feedback loop. Cortisol also reduces the effect of other neurotransmitters involved in happiness, like serotonin and dopamine. It weakens the immune system's ability to heal, but it ramps up the production of these substances called cytokines, which are elements of the inflammatory system. And cytokines can be pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. Cortisol increases the amount of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which act on the central nervous system and play a role in developing mental disorders such as depression and bipolar disorder, and physical disorders like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, etc. The emotions that come with the activation of the threat defense system are stuff like fear, so anxiety and worry, anger, frustration, and annoyance. Now, that's kind of talking about cortisol and adrenaline. Another aspect of the nervous system, however, is not just the sympathetic nervous system, but also the parasympathetic nervous system. You see, as we go about our day, our heart rate is never constant. It varies a little bit. But if someone is in a state of calm, that variability of the heart rate is fairly constant and it's regular. So if we plotted someone's heart rate on a graph, we'd see this kind of gradual, regular wave movement up and down at a frequency of 0.1 hertz. That is called low frequency heart rate variability. But when we're stressed out, we lose that standard regular variability. And the trace that we may sketch out on a graph becomes this jagged line. Now, what is regulating that low frequency heart rate variability is something called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the main part of the parasympathetic nervous system. And indeed, the parasympathetic nervous system is the counterbalance to all this threat defense system. The parasympathetic nervous system is this kind of rest and restore mechanism of the body. It's what restores our body back to normal health. And a main nerve in this parasympathetic nervous system is the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve has an afferent and efferent component. The afferent component of the vagus nerve is coming from the various organs of the body, the skin, the lungs, the stomach, the bowels, the pelvic organs, and it's leading to the brain. And the afferent vagus nerve feeds back from the various areas of the body to this nucleus in the medulla called the nucleus tractus solitarius, and then from there it goes to various different parts of the brain, such as the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And it basically just sort of calms down the threat defense system. It causes it to stand down. It also causes efferent signaling, which is when the vagus nerve goes away from the brain and has impacts on various regions of the body. For example, it kind of causes that low frequency heart rate variability, which is our best way to determine what's known as vagal tone. So just as the different degree of activation of a muscle is characterized as muscle tone, the different degree of activation of the vagus nerve is known as vagal tone. And that vagal tone, a high vagal tone, counteracts the threat responses of the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis. It increases our serotonin. It causes neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, i.e. it causes new nerve cells to be generated and increases the connections between those nerve cells. This is the opposite of what the threat defense system does. The stress response will kill nerve cells and kill the connections between them. And the vagal tone just sort of elicits these emotions of calm and satisfaction. Now, the vagus nerve, again, all these nerves are very strongly linked to the hormonal system as well. So just as adrenaline and cortisol are quite linked to each other and are produced by the same gland, the adrenal glands, the vagus nerve is also quite strongly linked to the hormonal system, particularly in this nerve called in this hormone called oxytocin. More on that later. But anyway, just some actions of vagal tone, and just in general, the parasympathetic system in general, it normalizes your blood sugar and your blood pressure, it increases your digestion, it relaxes your heart rate and muscles, it increases healing, it increases our immune surveillance, and our ability of our immune system to deal with illnesses and tumors, and it decreases inflammation in the body. And we can activate this vagal tone through two means. We can activate it through a bottom-up means, which utilizes the more primitive lower down parts of our brain, and we can increase our vagal tone through top down means, utilizing the more complex parts of our brain. The bottom up way of regulating our vagal tone is with our breathing. As I mentioned, breathing is regulated by the more primitive lower down parts of our brain, by the hindbrain, as I mentioned. And it's because when we're stressed out, basically the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems cause very different patterns of breathing. In the sympathetic nervous system, it causes this rapid breathing via the mouth, usually drawing air in and out of the upper chest, but not filling the whole lungs. And we see this kind of predominance of the in-breath over the out-breath. So an example of this kind of heavy sympathetic breathing is like that kind of pattern breathing. And that's good for physical exertion, but if it's prolonged, we get this chronic state of hyperventilation where we're getting too much oxygen and we're having too little carbon dioxide. And our body doesn't like that because of this principle of homeostasis. We like keeping relatively constant amounts of everything in our body. Now, our parasympathetic nervous system causes a different pattern of breathing. It causes a nasal pattern of breathing when we breathe in and out through the nose, and we're filling the whole lungs with oxygen. So the kind of air reaches all the way down our lungs into the diaphragm, which is this sheet of muscle at the bottom of our lungs. Hence, this pattern of breathing is often called diaphragmatic breathing. And it's this smooth, even breath which gives us the right amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, here's the thing. Because our nervous systems are so tied with our breathing, we can reverse engineer our nervous systems. By consciously doing even diaphragmatic breathing, we can activate the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, another way we can regulate vagal tone is by a top-down method of emotional regulation, i.e. utilizing the prefrontal cortex to access our detached, rational, observing self, i.e. in the process of meditation. Meditation, it's been advocated by Buddhist practice for centuries, if not millennia now, but it's now been vindicated by science as this legitimate mechanism of calming the body, both through bottom-up mechanisms, i.e. by regulating breathing, and by top-down mechanisms. Now again, I said that the vagus nerve is really strongly linked with oxytocin, and that is true. So the vagus nerve, a lot of the time, different aspects of our life cause the release of oxytocin, which also kind of calms down our limbic system and our threat defense system, but also activation of the vagus nerve through, for example, rhythmic touch, such as massage, or physical touch and affection in general, and also feeling full of food, that activates the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve inputs to our brain and causes oxytocin release. Some other kind of elements in our life that cause oxytocin release in the brain are feeling secure, having sex, and particularly having an orgasm, social interaction, eye contact, a handshake, spending time with people we like. And oxytocin does a lot of things in the brain. It promotes cell division and wound healing. It reduces our anxiety. It increases our curiosity and our capacity to learn. It increases caring and protective behaviors. It increases trust. It increases our desire to socialize. It also reduces the effect of pain. And the things which trigger oxytocin and increase vagal tone are stuff like feeling heard and acknowledged, feeling love, feeling affection, friendship, being moral and doing the right thing. All of this has actual neurological and physical effects. Now, so this kind of limbic system is a part of our elephant, but the limbic system, in a key thing, was also really heavily linked to our prefrontal cortex. The idea of rationality as independent from emotion isn't true at all. So the conceptualization of the rhino and elephant as separate things is a good oversimplification, but it's not actually true. That rider and that elephant are very intimately connected. In fact, there's a region of the prefrontal cortex called the orbitofrontal cortex. Now, the orbitofrontal cortex is kind of in response for processing positive emotions and processing reward, and also for processing negative emotions and disappointment, i.e. when our reward system is activated, our orbitofrontal cortex processes that and generates the feelings related to that, and also does the reverse. When our reward system is disappointed, our orbitofrontal cortex generates that negative emotion. And the orbitofrontal cortex is very important in emotion, but also in decision making. And it's a testament to the really important value of emotion in making decisions and making prioritizations. In fact, there's this kind of notion that if people were truly rational, for example, like Spock, if they were completely devoid of emotion, there would be decision-making machines. That's not true at all. In actual case studies where the emotional aspects of people's decision-making is impaired, they find it impossible just to make basic decisions. Emotion is a basic part of our decision making. Rationality does not exist independently of emotion. It is deeply tied to the limbic system and in fact evolved as a way to supplement our gut feelings and often to rationalize our emotions. It didn't evolve as this way to create this hyperlogical computational machine, but more on that later. So we've established that the prefrontal cortex can be mapped onto the rider part of the brain, and the limbic system can be mapped onto the elephant part of the brain. But there's another really important system in our brain, and that is the motivation reward system in our brain. And it's kind of like these 4 pathways in the brain, all of which use dopamine, all of which consist of dopaminergic neurons, which basically means neurons, i.e. brain cells, that communicate with each other via the hormone that is dopamine. And this pleasure reward system encompasses lots of different structures in the brain. Often these structures overlap with the limbic system. For example, the nucleus accumbens, the substantia nigra, the septal nuclei. So the limbic system is actually part of that motivation reward system, but the motivation reward system also stretches to our prefrontal cortex and especially our orbitofrontal cortex. The motivation reward system consists of 4 main pathways, basically referring to the actions of dopamine moving from structure to structure, causing the effects of motivating us to do stuff and generating pleasure and reward when we do stuff. These 4 pathways are the mesolimbic pathway, mesocortical pathway, the nigrostriatal pathway, and the tuberoinfundibular pathway. Now these 4 pathways cover lots of different regions of the brain, and the motivation reward system basically is very important for our survival, and it generates the impulses that we have to do stuff and to not do stuff. Basically, for example, it provides us with the motivation to carry out a behavior such as ingesting nutritious food, making shelter, mating, just doing anything which leads to some kind of physiological reward, i.e. the feeling of pleasure. The motivation reward system also causes us to avoid behaviors that lead to pain, i.e. hurting ourselves. That's a very simple example. There is this concept in psychology called the pleasure principle, which states that organisms seek to maximize their pleasure and minimize their pain. That's not necessarily true, as we'll explore in later podcast episodes, but the pleasure principle does apply to the motivation reward system in our brain, which again is kind of this system of loops and circuits in our brain, which form a part of this this motivational machinery. And that machinery, that motivation reward system is part of our elephant, but it very much affects how the rider thinks and what we do. Now again, a motivation reward system is evolved because it's very useful for survival. We need to pursue things to survive. For example, if you take mice and you block their dopamine receptors, i.e. if you block their reward system, they'll still enjoy eating food, but they'll just go through no effort at all to get it. Even if it's like a foot away from them, they won't walk to get food. Obviously, this is disastrous for survival. This also leads us to quite an interesting conclusion, and there's a bunch of other evidence backing this, but essentially, dopamine is not the hormone which causes the experience of pleasure. Dopamine is the hormone of motivation. It's a motivation hormone. Dopamine is about the anticipation of pleasure and the pursuit of pleasure. The actual pleasure itself is mediated by other chemicals such as endorphins and serotonin. More on that in the next episode. But essentially, that motivation reward system, often completely unconscious and bypasses cognition, we can often choose one thing over another without knowing why. For example, you're picking out a new color for curtains and you just have this gut feeling of, yes, that one. That's entirely subconscious process. You just decided to do that. Your conscious brain may rationalize that. It may generate some reason that makes sense to you why you've chosen that. But ultimately, that is a rationalization of a subconscious process. Now, dopamine does different things based on the different receptors that it hits on the different parts of the brain. This is because we don't actually have a huge number of hormones in the brain, so it's more efficient for the brain if we can get one hormone to do lots of different things by hitting different receptors. D1 receptors mediate pursuing impulses. They get us to pursue stuff. And D1 receptors are found mostly in a part of the brain called the ventral striatum, which is a part of the limbic system. And that consists of the olfactory tubercle and the nucleus accumbens. D2 receptors mediate aversive impulses in a region of the brain, again subcortical, called the dorsal striatum. Dorsal striatum and ventral striatum are both subdivisions of this structure called the striatum. The dorsal striatum involves these regions of the brain below the cortex in the cerebrum called the putamen, the caudate nucleus, and technically a region of the brain called the globus pallidus. Now, the dorsal striatum and also another brain structure called the subthalamic nucleus are part of this loop in the brain called the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is this circuitry in the brain, mostly subcortical, which is responsible for moving around, so the planning and execution of movements, but it's also responsible for reinforcement and reward, for the formation of addictive behaviors, and for the formation of habits. The basal ganglia also consists of the substantia nigra and the nucleus accumbens. The limbic system involves the substantia nigra and the nucleus accumbens. So we can see that there's some overlap between the basal ganglia and the limbic system. So, the basal ganglia, the limbic system, the motivation reward system, our system one of cognitive thought, all of that is the elephant in the Buddhist model. And the prefrontal cortex is the rider in the Buddhist model. This is a big oversimplification. But remember, the rider is subordinate to the elephant. Or, as multiple different philosophers have realized over the centuries, reason is subordinate to the passions. Humans are motivated more by emotions than reasons. And often, our rationality, our intellectual side, only exists to rationalize our gut feelings and emotions. An example of this is discussing politics with someone and attempting to change someone's mind. The philosopher David Hume said that reason is and ought to be a slave to the passions. And Spinoza also said, I'm just going to get up the quote, Spinoza said that those who think that men, quote marks, can ever be induced to live according to the bare dictates of reason must be dreaming of the poetic golden age or of a stage play. The idea that reason is subordinate to the emotions is not only advocated by lots of philosophers, but is also backed in modern science. For example, evolution didn't just generate that rational human brain overnight. The rational human brain occurred in increments. As the early ancestors of humans became more and more complex, our capacity for rationality developed more and more and more. But at each stage, the development of rationality had to be beneficial for survival. But here's the thing. Rationality evolved because it was beneficial in the moment, and necessarily, because humans weren't born with fully fledged capacities of rationality, we didn't evolve from that from the outset, necessarily in the early stages, rationality must have been as a supplement to the different parts of the brain. It was meant to guide the emotional parts of the brain, but not to overwhelm or kind of override the emotional parts of the brain. It evolved as a way to help the emotional parts of the brain realize their desires. It evolved to support the motivation reward system and the limbic system and figure out how we can gratify our urges and desires and impulses, or to use the Freudian parlance, our id. And even though it is possible nowadays for nowadays as in the form of modern anatomical and behavioral Homo sapiens, for human beings to override their urges and their instincts and their desires, it's notoriously really, really difficult to, because humans didn't evolve with that capacity built in. Now, we've established that in the Buddhist model, although there is this link between the rider and the elephant, they are still broadly separate. They're connected, but they do still refer to different sides of the human nature, and via different methods, which we will be exploring in this podcast, the rider can tame the elephant and exert greater control. There is not at all this kind of dualism in the mind and the body. See, Western medical thought for centuries used to believe that the mind and the body were entirely separate. What happened in the mind didn't affect the body, what happened in the body didn't affect the mind, and vice versa. The most famous Western philosopher who proposed this, and who kind of popularized this school of thought, was this philosopher called Descartes in the 1600s. You may recognize the name Descartes because he said, cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, therefore I am. But he also popularized that dualism, that separation of the mind and the body. We know now that this is not true. The modern scientific refutation of that is so deep, and there's so much research backing that, some of that we've explored earlier in this episode, that it just can't be true. And we now know that in fact it isn't. In fact, there's a whole field of medicine, psychosomatic medicine. Psycho is the prefix for mind, somatic being the suffix for body. There's a whole field of medicine which explores the overlap between mind and body in medicine. Now, in fact, there are various different kinds of pathologies or disorders called functional disorders. Irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, is an example of them, where there's nothing structurally wrong with the body. For example, if you look at the gut The way that the gut is structured is fine, but the function of the gut, the way that it's working, is what leads to problems. And stress, the kind of role of the mind and the emotions, is thought to play a really, really large role in that, because the link between the mind and the body is real and is modulated by physical things that we can measure and understand. For example, changes in the nervous system, the hormonal system, and the immune system. Now, so we have this idea of the rider and the elephant. Let's link this to happiness now. Happiness is necessarily going to involve both of these components. At one time, happiness can't be just the rider, because you cannot will yourself to be happy. You cannot say, I'm going to be happy now. Happiness is an autonomic process outside of our conscious control. It cannot be chased. It can be found, but it cannot be grasped. So it necessarily involves the elephant. At the same time, it is the job of the rider to create the conditions, both internal and external, for happiness to be achieved. For example, if you have a very unhealthy lifestyle and you surround yourself with terrible people and you're not actively trying to develop yourself or find any kind of meaning in life, it's obviously going to be very different for that elephant to be happy, because the rider isn't creating the conditions needed for it. Also, depending on your mindset and your outlook, if you harbor certain beliefs about yourself and about the world, about, for example, you being worthless or the world being a terrible place or your future being bleak, that also is obviously not going to be conducive to happiness. Happiness is about the rider and the elephant, and they have to work together. Now, they are appealed to, of course, in different ways. The rider, as I said, creating the right conditions, but also in the form of outlook and how you view yourself and the world. There's this famous quote by John Milton, the creator of Paradise Lost, which is, the mind can make a hell out of heaven and a heaven of hell. Basically, regardless of your external conditions, if you don't harbor the necessary internal conditions, the cognitive beliefs about views about yourself and your own value and your own worth, you're not going to be happy. Now, those three examples I gave earlier, those beliefs that you or a person may be worthless, their future may be bleak, and the world being a dark place, actually refers to a triad of beliefs called Beck's cognitive triad, and it's often seen in people with depression. Because essentially, the elephant and the rider, as I said, are very closely linked. And based on the emotions that you have, the emotions that you experience tends to play a very large influence in the thoughts that you form. And the thoughts that you form play a large influence in the emotions that you experience. Hence, in depression, you get this negative loop where you experience negative emotions. That leads to negative beliefs about yourself and the world, and that leads to more negative emotions. And different types of therapy, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, seek to break that cycle by encouraging the patient to harbor more positive beliefs about their self, their own abilities, and the world at large. But also, some other important stuff that the rider has to do is generate, again, as I said, the internal conditions for happiness. Humans are social animals, and the human life necessarily involves lots of other people. Harboring hatred for other people and intolerance and holding grudges is necessarily going to hamper your ability for happiness. And in fact, Buddhist meditation often focuses on developing feelings of love and kindness and tolerance and brotherhood towards your fellow man. In fact, for example, you may have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The top of that hierarchical pyramid is self-actualization. And a big part of self-actualization is a feeling of identification with humanity at large and feeling kind of a sense of brotherhood with other people. Morality is also a really key part of happiness. Doing good feels good. And there are evolutionary reasons why that's the case, which are explored both in next episode and in one of my polymath episodes. Polymath is the other podcast that I do, episode 5. But the key thing is that happiness does involve the rider as well. Also, finding meaning and engaging with life and having a general attitude of enthusiasm to life and a desire to treat life as an adventure and to approach it in good humor. Those are really important parts of happiness, especially the idea of finding meaning. And finding meaning is ultimately a cognitive process. It's ultimately something that the rider has to search for and the rider has to pursue. But of course, the elephant is a really large part in happiness as well. Lifestyle is a classic part of happiness. Diet being a really big thing. The food that you eat what you input in your body is necessarily going to impact your body in lots of different ways. And that doesn't mean I'm saying to start some fad diet like keto or detox or anything like that. There's a book called The Way to Eat, and it's this excellent nutritional handbook, and it just says all you need to know. The basic principles of a good diet are have lots of protein, minimize sugars, carbohydrates in the form of complex carbohydrates are okay, unsaturated fats are okay, try and minimize saturated fats, try and get lots of fiber. So eat lots of whole grain foods, nuts, seeds, try and minimize sweet treats, get lots of fruit and vegetables, try and eat protein-rich things like fish especially. Fish oil contains omega-3 and omega-6, which are very important for brain function and also for mood and happiness. Dairy is good. Dairy can contain saturated fat, but it actually contains this substance called, I believe, tryptophan, which your brain metabolizes to serotonin, so it plays a role in mood. There's a lot that I could say about diet, but generally, following scientific advice on diet, which you can access on the NHS, is a very important constituent for happiness. Be careful not to follow anything that calls itself alternative nutrition. Alternative nutrition is alternative because it's not backed by scientific research and therefore can't call itself mainstream. And a lot of the time, alternative nutrition will find one or two scientific studies and use them to back itself up. An individual scientific study or a few scientific studies can be biased, they can be wrong, they can lead to misleading conclusions. You have to look for scientific consensuses or consensi in order to make informed decisions. That's what mainstream nutrition does. Now, supplements can also be quite good for dietary functioning. You want to be careful of supplements because most of the time supplements are being sold by people who want to sell you something, but taking a multivitamin each day can be quite a good idea, especially in wintertime. In cooler climates or temperate climates like the UK, a vitamin D supplement can be a good idea as well. If you're looking into supplements, go on PubMed, Google search PubMed, P-U-B-M-E-D. It's this scientific database of lots of different research papers. And if you want to find out whether a particular supplement is actually useful, whether it's just snake oil, look it up there and just type it in the search bar and see what comes up and see if it's actually reliable. Exercise. Also really, really important for happiness. Regular exercise is so good for us. And there's so much evidence showing us all the different psychological mechanisms by which regular exercise helps us. The first research paper I ever did actually was about exploring these psychological mechanisms. Human beings evolved to be active. We evolved to be hunter-gatherers, i.e. to hunt and gather. And movement, regular exercise, in whatever form. You don't need to kill yourself lifting weights. Just going for a walk or a jog or doing something like climbing or biking with friends. That's so good for us psychologically and physically. Socialization and quality of relationships is also really important for the elephant to be happy. Human beings are social animals. We evolved to be with and live with other people. And of course, exposure to nature, very important for the happiness of the elephant. We're going to be exploring more of these different factors that lead to happiness in the rider and the elephant. But here's the thing. We just need to be aware that happiness is about appealing to both of these different components of us. And often these components can be in conflict with each other. And as a rider, if you're feeling a particular emotion, for example, stress or anxiety, you're never going to be able to shut that down through conscious effort. You cannot tell your elephant what to do. All you can do is acknowledge that you're feeling a certain way and try and do things that de-stress you. And of course, you can find a million different examples of de-stressing mechanisms online, and different people will have different repertoires of what helps them. But the key thing is, and by the way, this is something heavily encouraged in Buddhist meditation, you cannot control your emotions. You can only influence them by telling yourself things that may calm you down, and by acknowledging your emotions and not trying to fight against them. We can train our elephant over time with things like meditation and CBT, and by changing our outlook and our perspective on life. And there's lots of different sites and philosophy dedicated to doing this. Buddhism and Stoicism are two classic philosophies, both Eastern and Western respectively, that aim to change our outlook and our perspective on life, and therefore to try and retrain our elephant to kind of ease our threat defense system and our stress response system. But again, all of this takes time. Changing our elephant takes time. You can, as a shortcut, take certain medications, for example, antidepressants, in order to change our elephants. And this works because, again, our elephants our brain is not just a machine operated by different hormones, but hormones are the tools which that machine uses to operate. So an antidepressant like an SSRI, which increases the amount of serotonin in our brain, does make you feel better because serotonin is important in mood and happiness. But also, if you're unhappy, even though SSRI can make you feel better by helping to calm the stress defense system, you're not going to find happiness from just taking an SSRI alone. The point is that the neurochemical side of happiness, that elephant side to happiness, is one part of the puzzle, but also the cognitive psychological element of happiness, i.e. the rider, is another part of the puzzle. And we have to combine them. We have to appeal to both of these sides of the puzzle. But again, we cannot will ourselves to be happy. We can only set up the right conditions to help us achieve those factors which lead to happiness. And these factors are going to be discussed in episode 4 of this podcast. Now, even happiness itself, the emotion of being happy is an emotion, but it's a transient emotional state. Just as we may be sad if a sad thing happens to us, but that sadness eventually fades and we aren't sad 24/7, unless in the case of very poor mental health or in psychological pathology such as depression. These are transient emotional states which in the human condition, the standard human condition, influenced by pathologies, don't last. Happiness is like that as well. We may be happy transiently enjoying a great meal or spending time with friends or being at a concert, but really, what this podcast is talking about when it says understanding happiness is not how to achieve a transient state of well-being. It's how to achieve a general state of well-being, a general, long-term, long-lasting emotional state, emotional orientation of contentment and fulfillment and well-being. And in scientific parlance, this is called subjective well-being. It's what we may call contentedness. It's what we often refer to as happiness, but happiness in the sense of long-lasting well-being rather than transient joy and ecstasy. Now, understanding subjective well-being and where it comes from are going to be covered in subsequent episodes. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. This has been a very important theoretical grounding of happiness in the basis of the mind. And we're going to be exploring more about happiness itself now that we've done this necessary introduction in subsequent episodes. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. Have a lovely day.